Um, okay, good morning, good day, good evening. I would like to welcome you in the name of Pesticide Action Network to today's webinar on highly hazardous pesticides, HHPs, a global challenge. Today, we try to give an overview of a highly hazardous pesticides on HHPs and human rights perspective. What defines HHPs? What does it mean for people to be exposed to HHPs? And we would like to give a short insight of double standards in trade of hazardous pesticides. And examples are given of countries that are already acting against this. And we want to close with what are the ways towards a global phase out of HHPs? And we want to start to discuss this with you. So nice to have you all on board. I try to switch to the next slide. Maybe that's a bit slow. Okay, there we are. Oh, good. Just to introduce ourselves, Pesticide Action Network, we are a global network of 600 organizations in more than 90 countries, working to replace the use of hazardous pesticides with ecologically sound and socially just alternatives. And you are invited to visit our pan-international website for more information. Before you will get a short introduction on today's house rules, I would like to thank colleagues from PANAP for hosting the webinar and for the technical excellent support, to Pan India for their special support in creating the flyer and program, to colleagues from Pan UK for translating, and colleagues from Pan North America for sharing their experience. And also I want to thank the translators who are supporting us with the different languages today. And of course, I want to thank our co-sponsors, which are Pan Aotearoa New Zealand, Pan Asia and Pacific, Pan Germany, Pan North America, Pan UK, Public Eye, Rapal and Tanal. And I also want to thank the German Federal Agency, Environmental Agency, for their financial support of this webinar. And last but not least, thanks to all speakers who are sharing with us today their knowledge and experience today. And before I introduce them, I would give over the floor to my colleague to tell us, to share the house rules with us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Here are the house rules. I am Ilang Quijano, the Communications Officer of Pan Asia Pacific. So the first rule is everyone must turn their mics off when they are not speaking. There will be simultaneous translations in Spanish and French. So choose either the Spanish or French in the interpretation button at the lower right side of your interface. You should also know that this session will be recorded and transmitted live via Facebook. For all attendees, please type in your questions at the Q&A chat box. It is found in the lower part. Questions will be addressed at the end of all presentations. Please also be advised that the names of those who submit written questions will not be read aloud for your privacy. About spoken questions, they will only be entertained after the written questions if we have time. Use the raise hand button and wait for the moderator to call you if you want to raise a spoken question. Introduce yourself before speaking. So those are the house rules, and I hope that we understand them all clearly. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ilang. And so now I'm pleased to briefly introduce our speakers today in the order of their contributions. So I welcome Dr. Marcos Orellana, UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights. I cannot welcome Lars Neumeister. He felt ill, so I will jump in on his part. But I welcome Yaya Kumar Charlton, from the Director of Pan India, and Dr. Keith Terrell, Director of Pan UK, Dr. Peter Klausing from Pan Germany, Laurent Gaberel from Public Eye Switzerland, Arnaud Apotheker from Justice Pesticides, Dr. Muriel Watts, Director of Science and Policy, Pan Asia and Pacific, and Sarah Rangam, Director of Asia and Pacific. And my name is Susan Huffmans, and I'm from Pan Germany. And now all I have to do is giving the floor to Marcos Orellana, and I have to close my presentation. That might take a second. Okay. Marcos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a real pleasure for me to join this webinar convened by PAN International. I would like to start out pointing a few telegraphic ideas. The first one is that highly hazardous pesticides pose a human rights problem of global proportions, despite that states and business do not and cannot guarantee safe use. Highly hazardous pesticides remain on the market. Existing strategies and instruments are failing to deliver requisite protection, and the rights-based approach is key to overcome the assault on thousands of people exposed to these poisons. Those key messages by way of introduction, let me elaborate in the 10 minutes that I have. First of all, the exposure to highly hazardous pesticides pose a problem, a human rights problem of global proportions. The impacts on the right to health give an indication of this. Serious diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, hormone disruption, developmental disorders, sterility, neurological effects such as memory loss, loss of coordination, reduced motor skills, and chronic effects, years of after exposure, which makes it more difficult for the victims to access a remedy. Children and vulnerable groups are particularly at risk. Children because of their smaller organ size, because they lack key enzymes that detoxify pesticides. The International Labour Organization estimates that 60% of child laborers work in agriculture, especially in developing countries. And so is also the case of vulnerability of local communities who so often are impacted by aerial spraying. There's cases of spraying on schools, on top of villages. So despite there being regulations, often these regulations are not respected. Despite these exposure posing a global human rights problem, the international community is failing to address this problem. The global goal to minimize adverse impacts of chemicals and waste was articulated already 20 years ago in the Johannesburg summit. But I will pose a couple comments on this. First, that this global goal fails to properly characterize the problem. It takes a cost-benefit vantage point. Minimizing for the interests of some means exposing others. This is undue influence of the chemical industry. The strategic approach of international chemicals management has taken this poorly framed global goal forward. The Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management of the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization has also taken this language forward. This is the first point, the failure to properly characterize the problem. And this leads me to a second point. This is because minimizing global adverse impacts is not compatible with a rights-based approach, because health and environmental protection cannot be compromised for profit. A rights-based approach demands that each individual's life and health not be left behind, but a minimizing adverse impacts goal justifies and legitimizes trade-offs where some people suffer for the benefit, usually of corporate interests. And this takes me to a third observation on this goal, which is that as a matter of fact, the global goal was not met. This is the conclusion of the Global Chemicals Outlook report, the second one produced by the UN Environment Programme. In 2015, the fourth International Chemicals Management Conference took some encouraging steps in encouraging the use of alternatives to highly hazardous pesticides, but that has not resulted in meaningful progress in phasing out. The FAO, UNEP, the World Health Organization, with guidelines, with voluntary codes, the strategy did not work. At some point, about 15 years ago, in 2006, the FAO gave some signs with its progressive phase-out call, and then in 2008 with some criteria. But so many years have passed, and this year many were astounded by a memorandum of understanding between the FAO and CropLife, the Association of Trade that promotes pesticides. So is it moving in the right direction? Clearly not. And for that reason, my predecessor in the mandate on toxic and human rights, as well as a special rapporteur on the right to food, called for a global, legally binding, comprehensive instrument that would address highly hazardous pesticides in their life cycle. Such an instrument would need to be informed in order to be effective and legitimate by a rights-based approach. In any event, any post-2020 approach to highly hazardous pesticides requires a rights-based approach. And I would like to identify three elements here. First one is a vision to uphold human rights, to secure a toxic-free environment. This vision can articulate the right to science, the elaboration of public policies on the basis of best scientific evidence available, not to minimize adverse impacts, but to prevent harm and to address the hazards of highly hazardous pesticides as a class of dangerous substances and not one by one, which would take dozens, decades to implement and move forward. A second element that I would wish to highlight is the commitment to human rights protection, to put an end to the exploitation. The export of banned pesticides in their country of origin is a clear example of this. I'll come back to this point, but for now to mention that this practice transfers the harm to other countries, especially developing countries lacking the capacity and resources to address risks effectively. It also transfers the burden of chemical safety on workers. It is a form of discrimination because the human body is the same everywhere, and every life, all lives, are worthy of respect. And a third element is accountability and corporate due diligence, concrete phase-out plans for highly hazardous pesticides, clear timelines, reporting along supply chains. This is concrete application of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Along this vision, some elements for global cooperation. First, the affirmation of the centrality and the articulation of the precautionary principle. This is the normative dialogue between environment and human rights. This interaction has been affirmed by the Human Rights Committee in its revised general comment on the right to life. Right to science and scientific uncertainty go hand by hand, and that's where the precautionary principle plays a key role. Second of all, bans on exports, bans on imports of banned or restricted highly hazardous pesticides. Switzerland, France, the European Union strategy are taking important steps. A few years ago, the Committee on the Rights of the Child made recommendations to Mexico regarding an import ban of banned pesticides. At times it is said that human rights is territorial and a state cannot be held responsible for situations outside its boundaries because they're beyond their control. But international human rights law has evolved to recognize extraterritorial human rights obligations where the harms of an activity that takes place within the state has direct, clear, and foreseeable impacts outside its territory. And that is the case of highly hazardous pesticides. It is also sometimes argued that a ban would not be effective because corporations can produce these highly hazardous pesticides through their subsidiaries elsewhere. This is a question of corporate control, and one is then led to ask, does Monsanto Bayer control Germany, or does Germany control Bayer? And the same question can be asked about Syngenta in Switzerland and other corporations and their countries of origin. Extraterritorial obligations are an affirmation of the centrality of human rights in the face of globalization. I am running out of time, Ms. Moderator, if I could bear with one more minute to make 2 points. The first one is that in order to identify elements for global cooperation, there needs to be an articulation of an ethics of respect for the land and the people. And agroecology is emerging as a sustainable means of food cultivation, integrating ecology, cultural practices, and human rights. The UN Secretary General has announced convening a global food system summit in 2021, but the narrative of this summit is still dominated by corporate interest, by agribusiness, climate smart agriculture. The summit will not succeed if it intends to cater to all, especially to interest. To be clear, pesticides are not needed to feed the world. And so far, this summit is yet to embrace agroecology and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. So to conclude, the rights-based approach is indispensable for a proper and effective regulatory framework for highly hazardous pesticides. And the rights-based approach places a focus on vision, tools, and effective accountability to uphold the right to food, to health, and to a toxic-free environment. A rights-based approach focus on vulnerable groups, children, women, workers, local community. There is no safe use of highly hazardous pesticides, and a global approach to cooperation is thus sorely needed to close the protection gap that is condemning millions to disease and disability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marcos Oriana, for your very, deep introduction. Thank you. We are now coming to the second contribution that I have to share my screen. Just to mention that questions are collected and we will discuss or answer questions at the end of all contributions. There seems to be a difficulty. Can you see my screen already? Okay. Okay. So let's go into details. What are hazardous pesticides? Just start with that all pesticides are designed to inhibit the development of organisms or to kill them. So they harm specific pests or harmful fungi, which is intended, but they also harm non-target organisms, so like pollinators or amphibians, and also humans, and this is unintended. And their long-term and widespread use had led to an ubiquitous contamination of natural resources and has developed in some areas, as we heard, into a human rights issue. So highly hazardous pesticides are those pesticides that are particularly hazardous to human health or the environment. The term was introduced by FAO Council when they considered in 2006 a progressive ban on highly hazardous pesticides. And in 2008, the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, developed criteria to define highly hazardous pesticides, which we also call HHPs. And we also say that in 2015, the strategic approach to international chemical management listed HHPs as one of the so-called issues of global concern. So FAO and WHO defined HHPs as pesticides that are acknowledged to present particular high levels of acute or chronic hazards to health or the environment, according to internationally accepted classification systems such as WHO or GHS, which is the Global Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or their listing in relevant binding international agreements or conventions, or pesticides that appear to cause severe or irreversible harm to health or the environment under conditions of use in the country. So behind those, they defined 8 criteria to identify HHPs. The first is on acute toxicity. So if they meet the classes 1A or B of the WHO. And the criterion 2 to 4 is that if the pesticide meets the criteria of carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, or reproductive toxicity. We will get to know more details later. Criterion 5 to 7 is those that if a pesticide is listed under the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, or the Montreal Protocol. And criterion 8 is pesticides, active ingredients, or formulations that have shown a high incidence of severe or irreversible adverse effects on human health or the environment. So what FAO and WHO did not, and for since 2008 now, is to come out with a list so that we know which pesticides are HHPs. So in 2009, PAN International filled this gap and issued the first PAN International list of highly hazardous pesticides. Since then, it has been updated several times, and we are still working on the criteria as well. So our list is based on the FAO WHO criteria and supplements them with, for example, environmental criteria. And we include additional official classification of other authorities, like, for example, the International Agency for Research on Cancer or the US Environmental Protection Agency. So PAN's identification of HHPs is, so you can identify 4 groups. That is, first group, high acute toxicity, as we have heard already, WHO class extremely or highly hazardous pesticides, and we include also fatal if inhaled, because that is a way where a lot of people get poisoned by. And group 2, long-term toxic effects. I will not go into detail as we have a contribution on this especially. I just wanted to point out to endocrine disruptors, which are on our list as one criteria. Group 3 is environmental toxicity. We feel strongly that the joint criteria of FAO and WHO lacks environmental criteria, and we include acute high B toxicity according to US EPA, and also to cover the aquatic toxicity, pesticides that meet 2 out of the 3 criteria, very persistent in marine and freshwater, very bioaccumulative, or very toxic to aquatic organisms. And then it comes on our list. And as you have heard before, group number 4 is if they're covered in one of the conventions. Currently 310 pesticides are listed. We are working on an update, and of those only 34 are covered by those binding conventions, just to give you a picture. So this is all very technical. So we would like to see what it means for people to be exposed to HHPs on a daily basis and over decades. So I would like to give the floor to Yakumar Charlatan from Pan India, and I have to close my stop my screen sharing, and he will share his. Okay. I'm just having a difficulty to go back. Oh, I can do it here. Oh, it seems it's already done, right? It's already, you don't see my screen anymore?
We do.
Okay. It says it's not, you don't. Okay. Okay. Sorry for this. Jan.
Thank you, Susan. And yeah, I'll just in a very short presentation, I'll just try to share the challenges and issues from India. The pesticide poisoning is one of the oldest issues affecting human health and environment health in India. This is a report in 1958 where the poisoning of parathion on people this was actually a story of sailing ship from Mumbai to Cochin with both food crops and wheat and other food items, along with folidol, the methyl parathion, brought together and got mixed up, and we ended up with a fatality in my state, Kerala, in 1958, and that resulted in the Indian Insecticide Act, which was later framed in 1968 with rules in 1978, which is the current pesticide management law in the country. Since 1958, there are several incidences. I'll be trying to touch upon the incidences after 2000. The issue is not addressed bearing in mind the urgency and the damage it causes to the country. This is the reality in almost every country around the world. We heard Marcos telling us about the situation. Some good news in India is that there is an excellent science-based work on community-managed natural farming in the state of Andhra Pradesh, led by Dr. Vijay Kumar, who is also going to speak in the global summit with Marcos mentioned a little while ago. The same is now influencing the state and some of the central schemes. I can say that not the extent which we want to see in the government action, but to a relief or some small hope in seeing that there is going to be some policy changes. Back to the Kerala food poisoning in 1958, it was published in a journal of Indian Medical Association in 1958, volume 31, number 5, pages 2004 to 7. Parathion poisoning in Kerala in South India in April, May 1958. 828 cases of poisoning with 106 deaths. Out of this, 360 cases with 102 deaths were definitely proved to be caused by the poison. Food containing flour or sugar contaminated with folidol, the trade name of the Bayer product, E605, which is marketed as an insecticide under a variety of names. That is the incidence we had, which in a way gave birth to the Indian regulations and a whole bunch of thoughts. If you look at the HHPs, unintentional pesticide poisoning incidents in India, without including the poisoning from the production facilities across India, I mean, right from Bhopal or other endosulfan or other production facilities, or pesticide poisoning caused by transport of those pesticides in India. The major unintentional pesticide poisoning are one again in Kerala, starting from 78 to 2000, the endosulfan, which led a major policy change in my state, Kerala, and also we are happy that we could work with PAN and the global ban on endosulfan with Mariel and Sarojini Rangam. I'm so happy that they are also in this panel. Then we had the Bihar midday meals tragedy in 2013, which was monocrotophos, which killed 23 school children. Probably the next major incident is the Vidarbha region in Maharashtra, where acephate, diphenthurion, profenophos, cypermethrin, fipronil, imidacloprid, monocrotophos, about 63 deaths and over 1,000 poisoning cases. And for the last 4 years or 5 years, we are very seriously working on this issue, and we are following up. And thanks to Public Eye, and Lauren is here in this panel, we are taking the diphenthurion issue to a larger global arena. Perambulur in Tamil Nadu in 2017, again monocrotophos, acephate, profenophos, about 6 deaths with 300 hospitalization. Chamarajnagar in Karnataka, where monocrotophos was used by a priest in a temple to poison people, and 14 people died, and that was another major issue. 2019, we had paraquat dichloride poisoning, and there are some cases of unintentional and some cases of self-poisoning. This will be very broadly what we can say that the major issues in terms of listing the molecule versus the incident. Generally, if we look at the sources in India, we have poisoning caused by illegal use for agriculture or plant protection, meaning we use a large number of pesticides which are not registered for use in India, where as Marcos earlier put it, like the corporate agencies, they bring their own set of package and practice. They don't follow the laws. So we have that illegal use by the big companies. Poisoning caused by unintentional use, just like the endosulfan and other cases. Midday meal poisoning, we have 4 or 5 incidents in India, which I listed the major ones, but we also have in Andhra Pradesh and other states where we had the same thing. We also have serious problem of residues in food, and the major chunk of poisoning in India is with intentional poisoning or self-poisoning, which is also being monitored with clear numbers. I have not touched upon those self-poisoning in this presentation. A lack of regulation also creates a big problem for us in the way the pesticides banned in OECD countries, manufactured by companies and imported by their Indian subsidiaries and sold in Indian farmers who cannot use them in the field conditions. One classical example is diphenthurion, which is banned in Switzerland, produced by Syngenta and transported to India and sold by Indian subsidiary to Indian farmers who cannot maintain the field conditions to use the pesticide, and it harmed them. It is a clear violation of FAO code. It is a violation of Indian laws, but not much action is being taken. So we are pursuing along with the Public Eye to take it forward. If you look at the larger picture, for want of time, I'm not expanding myself. 295 pesticides are registered in India for use as on 30/11/2020, out of which 120 are highly hazardous pesticides. Generally, the pesticide trade is with incomplete labels. So we have several 28 languages, and we may have a label with a different language which no farmer can read in that area or the state, without user instructions, without treatment guidelines. In many cases, the medical doctors report to us, or they call us for help by giving the names and ask for the technical ingredients so that they can treat the patient. No warnings on half-life or re-entry. So there are incidences where people spray and immediately they re-enter to the field because there is no warning. There is also no instructions on mixing with other molecules. There is a general practice among farmers as recommended by the companies or the field agents of the companies to mix 6 or 7 different pesticides, both insecticides, fungicides, and variety of things together, so that they feel that it is much more stronger. It's also, we have reported to the in the Rotterdam Convention, and we also reported to the Government of India on decanting and illegal retailing of in almost all the states. Our case was on paraquat, and we have made an independent study, and we have been following up this case for some time now. So that is generally where we are now, and thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you everyone for giving this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayan, for your presentation, giving us an idea of what is going on in India. I now welcome Keith Tyrrell from Pan UK.
Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So at Pan UK, we've been conducting a number of health monitoring surveys for many, many years now to try and unpick the conditions of use that lead to pesticide poisoning, to understand the actual rate of pesticide poisoning, and indeed in some cases to try and identify the specific pesticides that are causing the most problems. What I'd like to share with you today is the results of some of the surveys that we've been conducting over the past decade or so. These surveys typically are of anywhere between a few hundred to over 1,000 farmers, and we've conducted them across Africa and Central Asia in the past 10 years. What you can access a report on our website, which has a lot more detail, but I'll give you some of the flavor of the findings that we've found so far. So the top level results you can see here is that acute pesticide poisoning occurs everywhere, and it occurs at very high rates. Out of the studies that we show here, the lowest we've got is about 8%, which was a very low number, but most of them are over 40, 50% of poisoning. These are smallholder farming communities typically. Sometimes, you know, as high as 60% is not unusual. So this tells us that acute pesticide poisoning is the norm effectively in smallholder farming communities around the world. If you're working with highly hazardous pesticides, the chances are that you're going to get poisoned during that year. And as we've heard, some of those poisoning results in long-term serious health effects. When we do our surveys, we try and ask farmers about the symptoms that they've experienced over the year. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to. And some of those symptoms are quite mild. They may be transient, things like headaches or nausea, which indicate that a farmer's had a severe dose of pesticides. But some are much more serious. Some of these are things like tremors, things like loss of consciousness, and these indicate severe neurological damage from pesticide poisoning. And this is the result of a survey that we conducted in 6 Central Asian countries. We've got 5 of the countries here. And you can see here that quite a significant number of the poisonings would fall into the classification of severe harm. Now, that means that farmers are going to be suffering long-term harm, most likely over many years as a result of this. The other thing we find out again and again is that poisoning is hidden. Farmers in low and middle income countries do not tend to go and get medical help. That can be for a whole range of reasons, either because medical coverage is patchy, there aren't many medical practitioners in farming communities in the region, or because it costs money to go and see a doctor. And let's face it, many of these farmers are poor smallholder farmers, farming land 1, 2, 3 hectares. It's a really significant cost. So they try and hold off unless it's really serious before they go and get medical help. The result of this is that hardly any of the poisoning incidents that we picked up through our health monitoring actually enter the national statistics. So governments and policymakers, as far as they're concerned, it's invisible. It's not an issue because it's not entering into the statistics that they use to base their policy development on. And why does pesticide poisoning happen? When we speak to farmers, when we conduct our surveys, one of the things we try and do is understand the exposure routes. How do farmers get exposed? Is it through skin contact? Is it through breathing in? Is it through contamination of the food while they're eating? And we try and track the most prevalent causes of exposure. And here's some results from a couple of surveys that we conducted in Senegal and Mali. And you can see that practices which policymakers assume do not exist when they license pesticides are actually completely prevalent. Look, in Senegal, 95% of farmers don't use protective protective clothing. 71% store pesticides at home. 33% in Mali spray into the wind. You know, these are the when policymakers license pesticides, they assume that all of these practices do not occur, that farmers use pesticides according to the label, but the reality is that they don't. And that's why people get poisoned. And as I say, it happens all over the world. Here's the results from Central Asia. You know, 100% of farmers, none of the farmers that we questioned in Belarus used PPE, personal protective equipment. You know, the best that we can hope for is in Kyrgyzstan, 52%. So I hope that this short presentation has given you an indication that pesticide poisoning occurs everywhere where pesticides are used, particularly in low and middle income countries, that it is the norm, not the exception, and that, as Marcos said, safe use is just not possible with highly hazardous pesticides. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for drawing this picture. I would like to give floor to Peter Klausing now. Keith has to stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try now again. Now we can start, right? Okay, thanks. I will try to give a brief overview of chronic health effects of highly hazardous pesticides. And before going into details, I first wanted to point out that when we talk about chronic health effects, it does not need to mean that it is a chronic exposure. There are long-lasting effects which even can occur after short insult or short-term exposure. And this can actually have long-term consequences. This has also significance with regard to the discussed acute health effects, or acute intoxication, poisoning, which have been rightfully stressed several times already during this session. But I'll return to this and just would like to do a brief recap of what types of effects are considered chronic health effects as related to pesticide exposure intoxication. Genotoxicity, damage to the DNA, is the first one. Tumors due to carcinogenic effects is the second category, and I highlighted it a little bit because I will return to this issue on the next slide. Reproductive toxins are impairing fertility, causing malformations in the unborn baby, can cause intrauterine death or postnatal damages. Endocrine disruption is recognized on the list of HHPs by PAN International, but as far as I recollect, it's not on the list, and it's lacking actually in the effects considered by FAO, WHO, whereas WHO, FAO consider so-called severe effects of high incidence, which I would, for instance, consider kidney failure, notorious in some countries of Central America and in Sri Lanka. And this, I think, is a severe effect, which, however, has not been clearly defined by the two international bodies. When talking about chronic effects, we actually want, that's the declared intention, we want to avoid that such pesticides get into the environment, are becoming used. But as we all know, there are many examples that they have been used, but the intention is to use animal studies under standardized conditions and with a defined dose or exposure to find out whether, using the example of carcinogenicity, whether the compound is carcinogenic. Of course, there's the necessity to distinguish between true effects caused by the compound and spontaneous effects seen as background incidents in the population. But we should be aware that this spontaneous incidence, of course, is also not as spontaneous as it may seem, because these spontaneous incidences of tumors are, of course, caused by some unknown factors which actually exist in the environment or in our body. Trying to distinguish between these true and spontaneous effects, number one, these standardized animal studies are used, then mechanistic evidence to explain the effects seen is sought, and at the end, epidemiological studies are coming up only many years later and often have been showing that pesticides which have been tested in animal studies at the end have and considered harmless, and at the end have been abolished, have been banned because of the effects seen in epidemiological studies. I highlighted also the endocrine disruptive effects, and I would like to make you aware that from the around 800 chemicals which are currently known or suspected to be endocrine disruptive, about 100 or maybe even more are pesticides. And when we talk about endocrine disruption, the main and most concerning effect is not a disturbance of our hormones as we sit here in front of the screen, but it is because hormones have a very important organizing effect during differentiation of cells and tissues during embryonal and fetal development, including, for instance, brain development, postnatal brain development in humans, which by 50%, and I'm talking about morphological differentiation, 50% of the human brain is differentiating after birth. And hormones play a role in this and can lead to, in later life, due to this early disturbance, to diabetes and other metabolic diseases. Disturbance in behavior, decrease in intelligence quotient in humans, infertility, damage to different endocrine organs, particularly to the thyroid, and also can be a cause of cancer. And of course, there's a plethora of academic peer-reviewed study, which there is definitely no time to go into detail. But at the end of my presentation, I would like to point out that this low exposure, big effect phenomenon of chronic health effects by highly hazardous pesticides is actually related to the acute intoxication, which has been talked about during this session already several times. And the logic behind this is that if there is acute intoxication, which is an expression of high exposure, high enough to recognize symptoms, this at the same time means that there is a more or less constant low level exposure, which can lead to these chronic effects, which I have tried to demonstrate. And beside that, the effects are delayed in humans and can only be studied when there has been done damage already since for many years. And then in addition, we have multiple exposures, but in the animal studies in this so-called hazard and risk assessment, there is only a single assessment of an individual compound until approval for market. In general, I think there is much too few peer-reviewed epidemiological studies from the global south. And the only conclusion as a toxicologist, I have to say for myself, is that highly hazardous pesticides have to be banned and agroecology to be used as the alternative to this. And with this, I would like to close.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing this with us. I would now like to give the floor to Laurent Gabrel. Laurent.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen, my presentation? Okay. Okay, so I will today briefly discuss this issue of the double standards in trade of highly hazardous pesticides. When we talk of the double standard, what we mean is that, at least in relation to the European Union, is that many of the highly hazardous pesticides have been banned in the EU now because of the stricter regulation that was enacted already in 2002 and then in 2009, which now includes the so-called cutoff criteria, which means basically that if you have a pesticide that is found to be carcinogenic, an endocrine disruptor, a reproductive toxicant, it should be out. It should not be allowed in Europe, although of course there's some weaknesses and issues with implementation in general, we could say that the most hazardous pesticides have already been banned in Europe. So what we did is we wanted to see who are the companies that sell highly hazardous pesticides worldwide, and we did a research on CropLife. CropLife is the international lobby of the agrochemical companies. It includes the main pesticide manufacturers, Bayer, Syngenta, BASF from Europe, but also Corteva and FMC based in the US. And those companies, they claim to be responsible and innovative company. They argue that, in fact, they're not the one selling highly hazardous pesticides worldwide, that in fact, most of the HHPs are sold in developing countries by Indian or Chinese manufacturers. So we did this research to test this claim. We could access some data on pesticide sale by a company called Phillips McDougall.
Excuse me, Laurent.
Yeah.
Can you change to presentation mode? Because it's quite small for us to see.
Okay.
Sorry for
like
the
that?
interruption.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So what we did is to access this data on pesticide sale. Then we use the list of PAN of the highly hazardous pesticides, the 300 plus highly hazardous pesticides. And what we found is that, in fact, contrary to what they claim, the sale of highly hazardous pesticide is really at the core of the CropLife company business model. If you see overall, on average, it's about 1/3 of their sales that is made with those highly hazardous pesticides. You see that glyphosate is, of course, one of the biggest seller, and some would disagree that this one qualifies as HHPs. But if you look at the others, like glufosinate, atrazine, ciproconazole, and others, they're all acetochlor, they're all banned in Europe for quite some time. And there's no question that those are highly hazardous pesticides, and those companies are making billions out of it. On the right side of the screen, you can see the detail by company. You can see that the average is 1/3 of the sale made with HHPs, but it's higher with Bayer and Syngenta, for example, which make nearly like 40% of their sales with HHPs. The next finding we had is that, in fact, most of their sales with HHPs, they make them in low and income countries, low and middle income countries, where we know that regulations are weaker. What we could do is compare the CropLife sales in some key low and middle income countries with their sales in richer countries. And you can clearly see a trend that in most LMICs, the share of HHP within the CropLife pesticide sale is quite high as compared to what you see in Europe, especially, although in the US, the proportion of HHP is higher. We know that in the US, the regulation is weaker, and a lot of HHPs that are banned in Europe, for example, are still allowed in the US. But you see that in India, for example, it's nearly 60% of CropLife pesticide sales that are made with highly hazardous pesticides. And then we did also a research to see what are the crops that mostly used the CropLife HHPs. And you can see that the proportion is pretty high in soybean or cotton, for example, and much lower in cereals. I think that has to do with the fact that in cereal, less HHP are used on average compared to what you can see, for example, in cotton. Some of those highly hazardous pesticides, well, most of the highly hazardous pesticides are banned in Europe, but some of those sold by CropLife are in fact even produced in Europe. That's what we found out in a second investigation that we released this year. We could access the data from the regulators on the export of banned pesticides, because this is a practice that is illegal, but that is highly unethical in our view. And you can see that nearly like more than 80,000 tons of pesticides that were banned in the EU because of the high risk to the environment or health, were in fact allowed to be exported abroad in 2018. You can see that the export are coming from virtually like each and every EU countries, but most of the volumes are coming from the UK, Italy, Germany, and Netherlands, France, Spain, and Belgium. We could also map, this is another way to represent the same data. You can see the main substances, for example, paraquat, which is a highly toxic pesticide banned for years in the EU, but still exported abroad. Most of the volumes are going to UK, but also then Brazil, India, Ukraine, and other countries in which we know that the safe use of paraquat is just impossible. You can see the names of the companies. Overall, we had more than 30 companies involved in the trade, and in total about 41 different chemicals, too dangerous for use in the EU, but allowed to be exported in other countries. This was to give you an indication of, we did a focus on some exporting countries, the UK, France, Germany. They all allow the export of several chemicals that are banned on their own field. And this was also a visual we did to show some of the key developing countries that import those chemicals from the EU. For example, we were quite shocked to see how many different chemicals are imported by South Africa. I think it's more than 10 banned pesticides that are exported from the EU to South Africa in 2018. And we know that the conditions of use in this country have nothing comparable to what's happening in the EU. So that was for the problem, what we call the hypocrisy of countries like in the EU and Switzerland, which allows their own companies to sell abroad pesticides that were considered too dangerous on their own field, and that even in some cases allow the production in their own territory and export of those dangerous chemicals. So I start with the bad news, which is that this year we had a key vote in Switzerland on an initiative that would have placed mandatory due diligence on multinational companies based in Switzerland. And we would have hoped that this would have ensured that they cannot, pesticide manufacturers like Syngenta cannot continue to just ignore the risks linked to their product. Unfortunately, we won the vote, but we lost it in the sense that we won the majority of the population. But in Switzerland, you need a double majority. You need also the states within Switzerland, the majority of the states within Switzerland to agree to the initiative. And this was rejected this year. But the good news is that the Swiss government decided to ban the export of some banned pesticides this year. This was following several research that we had published also with you, with Pan India, on the impact of those exports in the countries, on the farmers in the countries. And that was really a good success this year, that they decided to ban the export of 5 hazardous pesticides that had been exported in previous year. So really a good start. And the other good news was that a similar decision was taken at EU level this year as well, although this is at the moment only a proposal by the Commission, but you can see that it's quite broad because they are proposing a ban on the export of all the hazardous chemicals that are banned in the EU. So not only pesticides, but all hazardous chemicals banned in the EU would not be allowed to be exported in the future. They are also proposing due diligence obligation about the use of chemicals for companies. And so if this is still to be adopted by the Council and the EU Parliament, but we believe that if this is adopted, it would make a huge difference. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Laurent. And now I would like to now we would like to see 2 examples of countries that are already active beyond what Switzerland is already doing. And we start with France, and afterwards we go on with Palestine. Arnaud, it's to you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm trying to share the screen. I guess do you see it now? Trying to put it on a, okay. Well, first I'd like to thank PAN International for the invitation to mention the French law, which is the law related to highly hazardous pesticide, and which is, to my knowledge, the first law that is addressing this morally unacceptable practice of exporting a pesticide ban in its own country. This law is a law which has been adopted in October 30, 2018, and which is called, and the name is very long, as you see, is a law for balanced trade relation in the agriculture and food sector and healthy, sustainable, and accessible food for all. It is a wide-ranging law of which pesticides are only one point, and certainly not the main point, as you can see in the very long title of the law. NGOs have been mobilized in France, individually and collectively, to try to get the most of this part, mainly about the environmental and health issues. However, it has been very disappointing for most NGOs because many of their demands has been in fact rejected or not taken into account. And that's why I mentioned this just to say we have a very good point in the law, but it is not as such a law that has been welcomed with enthusiasm by NGOs because it has rejected many of their requests. For example, a ban on glyphosate that had been promised by our President of the Republic. It has rejected the ban on rebates and discounts on the prices of pesticide, a ban on the sale of some of the most dangerous biocide products, and also they have rejected the need for regulate the use of pesticide near homes. But it contains a very positive step that should be copied everywhere we can. The Article 83 of the French law has modified the rural and maritime fishing codes, which provides now, and it's a quote, the production, storage, and circulation of plant protection products containing active substances not approved for reasons related to the protection of human health or animal health or the environment are prohibited as of 1st of January 2022, subject to compliance with the rules of the World Trade Organization. The circular that implements this article of law has been published on 23rd of July 2019. And according to this circular, non-approved substances are only those which, following their evaluation by EFSA, are subject to an implementing regulation not approving or not renewing their authorization for reasons of environmental or health hazard. As soon as this circular has been published, the lobby of the pesticide industry, the Professional Association of Pesticide Producers, have made a recourse to the Council of State on the grounds of excess of power from the Ministry of Agriculture. And just after that, they also requested the Council of State to refer to the Constitutional Council the question of the conformity of the provision that ban exports with the rights and freedom guaranteed by the Constitution. It maintains then this provision disregards the freedom to enterprise, which is guaranteed by Article 4 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. So the Council of State has decided in November 2019 to refer this question of constitutionality to the Constitutional Council on the ground that the pesticide lobby plea raised a serious issue, and it decided to stay the ruling on the request until the Constitutional Council ruled on the question of constitutionality. And that was in January this year. Then the Constitutional Council decided that these provisions were in fact consistent with the Constitution. And that was partly due to the fact that the Charter of the Environment has been incorporated in the French Constitution in 2004. Then, and it is a very recent decision, the Council of State, after the Constitutional Council, concluded that the plaintiffs, the producers' union, and the seed owners are not entitled to request the cancellation of the circular. That means it is now adopted, whatever, at the highest level. So this has been a fight for many years. In fact, maybe also we have had success on this fight. Publicly, the fight was on other issues which are closer to domestic worries of people, like, unfortunately, what we lost, such as a ban on glyphosate. But still, the pesticide lobby has fighting really strongly against such ban. And that means, to my mind, that we need to be really careful in drafting every law or text of law that would relate to banning export of pesticide. And as Laurent has mentioned, the Commission is thinking about it. And I think it is a very good news, but it has to be redacted or written in such a way that it cannot be contested at the European Court of Justice. The second point, which I think is worthwhile mentioning, is the value of enshrining environmental protection in national constitutions. That has been, in fact, the tool that allowed us to keep this decision on export ban, which was fought on other constitutional rights, which is the right to enterprise. So it has been a very good effect to have a constitution keeping getting in its whole the necessity of protecting the environment. And lastly, in order to see whether we can extend this kind of law in other countries, we probably need to get a better understanding if the French law, in fact, is prohibiting the export of formulated products or which are, in fact, authorized or negated at the national level, or if it prohibits also the export of active ingredients, of which the authorization is given at the EU level. So I think there is a lot of work now for lawyers to think of to finally be able to have at the European level the export ban which is needed to make sure we don't play with the health of individuals and population elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnaud, for giving us insight in what is going on in France. And I'm now asking Mariel to share her presentation, please.
Good evening and good morning and good afternoon. Can you see that presentation now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Sorry.
Mariel speaking, following.
Sorry, Mariel, we can't see it yet. It's not there. No.
Okay.
That looks good.
You can see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So following on from the attempts of the European Union and Switzerland to ban the export of pesticides that they have banned, I want to talk about the only country that I know of that has actually banned the import of such pesticides, and that's Palestine. In 2012, the Palestinian Authority set forth a strict regulation on the management of pesticides. This did a number of things. It required anybody who was going to import pesticides to be trained as an agricultural engineer, to apply to the government for each lot of pesticides they wanted to import. Those pesticides had to go to a government warehouse and be checked by the government before they could be dispersed. And it prohibited the import of pesticides that are banned in their country of origin for reasons of health or environmental problems. Exactly what we've heard already from the attempts in the European Union and Switzerland. So that was already in 2012. The Palestinian government is very active in inspecting everything that comes into the country and confiscating illegal pesticides. And here you can see a major sting by the Palestinian Authority to track down and remove illegal pesticides. This is one that I photographed in Palestine a few years ago. It's a bottle of paraquat and diquat manufactured by Syngenta, whose home country, as we know, is Switzerland. It's actually manufactured in the UK. Both the UK and Switzerland have banned paraquat in their country of origins, and that was the sole reason it was therefore banned in Palestine. So that's actually the end of my slides, but I just want to finish by saying that whilst we wait for the European Union and the Switzerland and France and all the other countries who are exporting pesticides to make a law to ban their export of their banned pesticides, every country can do what Palestine has done. Every country can actually stop the import of banned pesticides if they wish to do. And in fact, just the European Union banning the banned pesticides isn't sufficient to stop this problem. Many other countries like India, like China, like Brazil also export pesticides that they've banned. It's a global phenomenon. And the only way that countries can protect themselves against it until we have a treaty that makes it illegal to have this kind of trade is countries themselves can very simply put in place a regulation that bans the import of pesticides banned in their country of origin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariel. So now, please, Saro, for our last presentation.
Thank you, Susan, and great, happy to be here. My focus is how do we do a future, securing a future without highly hazardous pesticides. And the way forward that we have identified as PAN is and this actually came out of from the special rapporteurs on right to food and toxic 2 years ago. And that's a global mechanism to phase out and ban HHPs. And I think Marcus also mentioned this quite strongly. The second is we feel very strongly that a strong support for alternatives, particularly agroecology that supports farmers and small food producers is key. And ensuring corporate accountability and stopping double standards, but really we need to make corporations liable for the pesticide poisoning that is occurring everywhere, particularly in the South, and in line with the demands of small food producers for food sovereignty, including protecting their lives, their communities, and their livelihoods. So this is the gist of what I'm going to talk about. just some background. So as I mentioned, we're pushing for a globally legally binding mechanism or treaty to ban highly hazardous pesticides. And it's based on the proposal by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and by the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics. We are talking about a life cycle management of pesticides. We thought that we could start with a global action plan on HHPs that's being drafted by FAO. But given the reality of what's happening in FAO, the concern about the alliance between FAO and CropLife, that it's going to be maybe difficult, maybe more watered down, but I think it's a good starting point. But that's the reality of what's happening within FAO. And we have seen all these photos of the DG of FAO having, good meetings and supporting Bayer and Syngenta and CropLife all over the media. So it's quite a area of concern for us. The other aspect is we've been also working very much, and I think a lot of my colleagues in PAN have been, working within the SICOM process, the strategic approach on international chemicals management, or SICOM, to push for a mechanism to deal with issues of concern that could actually trigger a much more stronger response, including legal mechanisms, legally binding mechanisms to deal with these issues of concern, and highly hazardous pesticides are one of the major areas of concerns. As Marcus mentioned, it's got to be based on human rights approach and what's the reality on the ground. And we've heard from Keith, you've heard from Jayan, and you've heard from others about the reality on the ground of the horrendous use of pesticides. And this is one where, Pan India found paraquat being sold in a polythene bag. And the pharmacist carrying it, and using it. And that's kind of the horrifying, horrendous use that is the reality in Asia and the global South, and even maybe in pockets in the North. Why do we need a global treaty? As was mentioned, the failure of pesticide management at the national level. It's also the failure of global regulation of pesticides. Every time, we are in Rotterdam Convention, the Conference of Parties, or the Stockholm, or the Basel Convention, we are talking about one pesticide, one molecule that's being discussed. And it takes, with so much of, the need to build consensus, paraquat has not got onto the list of, pesticides in the Rotterdam Convention. And it's crazy. And we know that this is a convention that is for information sharing. And even that is a problem for CropLife and some governments who are producing paraquat. The illegal trade, we know that happens. We've done a lot of documentation of illegal trade, the dumping to countries like Laos, Cambodia, from Thailand, from China, and other parts of the world. Then we know of double standards in exporting banned pesticides. And I think that one is quite critical, because PAN Germany did a very wonderful documentation, and we heard from Laurent some of that. About 60,000 tons of pesticide ingredients are, which are banned in Germany, are being, sold in other parts of the world. And 9 pesticides in particular, which are highly hazardous pesticides, are part of this double standard, where, produced in Germany, dumped in third world countries. of course, the failure of industry to manage containers and unused stock properly. So they say the recommendation is, spray as much as you can, to finish your available stock. That's what farmers are told. Even if there's going to be a ban next year, use up your stock. And so, poison everyone, poison the environment before we, institute a ban. And then, of course, the biodiversity crashing, we've heard of this everywhere, study in Germany in terms of the insecticides, disappearing, birds disappearing. And the new study that that was recently published in BMC that is being authored by many of our scientists in PAN, human poisoning, which continues unabated. Of recent study shows 385 million farmers and workers are poisoned by pesticides each year, and the power of the pesticide industry. And we have done a lot of documentation on violations of human rights. What will it do? Phase out HHPs, promote agroecology, the liability on pesticide producers. We want to make sure that they are responsible for the pesticide poisoning. And we have the cases in India, in many parts of the world, but as Jain was saying, we are bringing it to OECD, we are bringing it to Switzerland in terms of a legal challenge, a legal case against Syngenta, and remove double standards of exporting pesticides banned by that country. It also includes prevent sale of pesticides that require PPE in countries where it is too hot or where not readily available or affordable, and the need for global monitoring of impacts on human health, biodiversity, environmental effects, and basically establishing comprehensive national action plans. And we do this because we want to protect our children, we want to protect the communities that are being exposed, the most vulnerable, and those are the poorer sectors, but it's also the farmers, our workers, and our indigenous peoples. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to say that we need to support small food producers, and protecting the health and the environment of small food producers who are the most affected and the most vulnerable, and their communities is really essential, as well as consumers who are consuming these products, this food, and ensuring their livelihoods with agroecology. So they are demanding food sovereignty, and we are supporting the call as part of protecting the health and the environment of small food producers and ensuring their livelihoods with agroecology. And just wanted to show that this photo is of women who got the land, and they're working collectively to grow food for their community and the population with agroecology. So they're working together to make sure that good food, and healthy food will be available to their families, communities, and to the consumers. Thank you very much. And this is an organic farmer who's very happy to be an organic farmer. She said, this is what I want to do. I don't want to use pesticides anymore. I want to be an organic farmer. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saro. Thank you to all of you. You might have recognized that we run out of time, which was nearly to be expected because all the technique and changing takes more time than expected. But if it's possible, if Elna doesn't oppose, perhaps we can at least have like some of the questions to be read aloud and to be answered by the speakers, because there's a lot of going on in the chat and in the question and answer section. So I just have a look and would like to, there was one incoming question, maybe that goes to Marcos or Elana. Would the rights-based approach consider rights of nature, ethics, and paradigm-based approach, as that would in one move cover all you tackled about? Was this clear, or shall I read it?
I can take a stab. Thank you, Susan. A human rights-based approach is by definition anthropocentric. It is grounded, it is rooted in the dignity of the human person, individuals and groups. But the experience of humans on the planet is not abstract. We are not abstract entities. We are situated, and the environment is the context in which we live. And for that reason, rights of nature, or nature more generally, our ecosystems and our experience with our communities, they make up the historical concrete experience of every individual and every person. It is for that reason that the right to a healthy environment has been interpreted by regional human rights courts as encompassing protection for the autonomous components of the environment. So not just in utility to humans as beneficial to health or life, but the protection of forests or the protection of biodiversity, as the case may be. The importance of the right to a healthy environment in national constitutions has been underscored by other speakers. I want to echo that. Despite the large number of countries incorporating the right to a healthy environment in national constitutions in the last 50 years since the Stockholm 1972 Conference on the Human Environment, there still is no global recognition of this right. And there is a call by hundreds of civil society organizations to the Human Rights Council, pushing and demanding for this, for the Human Rights Council to recognize at the global level the right to a healthy environment. This would not only bring human rights and the environment closer together, it would also incorporate rights of nature into the human rights setting. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much. That was very clear. All panelists can also answer the questions in a written manner if you see there's an answer you would like to give. So there was a question to Jayakumar. Is there a best way to clean fruits and vegetables after you purchase them from the market that does not declare information about what pesticides have been used while growing them, especially when alternative markets are not available? So this is a very question from daily life.
To the best of my knowledge, no. Generally, the pesticide industry or the agriculture scientists used to say that you can use vinegar or other stuff to wash and clean, but it just helps in cleaning the outer surfaces or the thing on the top, on the skin, but not the pesticides in the fruits or crops. So I think the only answer is we have seen that in India, as Saro earlier said, small communities of women or kids around the villages, they are starting up their own alternative stores. Support them, buy directly from the farmer. You don't need a store. But I don't believe in any so-called magic of washing the pesticide out, because it is not, it's outside, it is mostly, the whole approach to pesticide use is a very internal issue. We need to flush it out to flush the pesticide from the food we are eating. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Jan. I'm going back to the question section. So there's I'm shocked about the low to non-existent percentage of pesticide users having personal protection. Is there no governmental control regarding sales and usage of pesticides in the country that were part of the survey? That goes to Keith. In Germany, users do have to do training over 2 years and have access to PPE. is there any, so perhaps Keith, you can.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, basically, there are very few countries actually have a requirement, and those countries that do have a requirement do not enforce it. We're talking about low and middle income countries here. And it's because it's expensive, it takes time, it takes resources. And why would governments bother doing that when the problem is invisible to them? As I mentioned in my talk, the data that they rely on is partial and incomplete. So it's not coming across their radars as a big problem because they're looking in the wrong place. I mean, the other thing is that where PPE is available, it's often expensive, and in often places it's not available. So, for example, we did a study in Senegal. The study that I highlighted there, as a result of that study, we made the farmers aware of the harms of pesticides to themselves, and they lobbied their local cotton ginnery. They were cotton farmers asking for PPE, and the cotton ginnery did provide PPE, but the farmers had to pay for it. And the cost of a a respirator that was suitable to deal with the pesticides that they were working with was the equivalent to an entire year's salary of a cotton grower. So they just don't use it. It's too expensive, it's not available, it's uncomfortable, and it's not enforced. Thanks.
Yes, Mariel. Why are you
Yes,
raising? Yeah.
I would just like to add to that even where PPE is available and it's the appropriate PPE, it's not always effective. There's a certain amount of chemicals still goes through the PPE and it doesn't actually do its job completely properly. The other point is in the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management, Article 3.6 states that countries where farmers are growing in hot or humid climates should not be using pesticides that require PPE. And so that actually, if that single article of the code was implemented, most of the pesticide poisoning problems would go away because most of the pesticides would not be able to be used.
There's a question of clarification that goes to Saro. What do you mean by alliance between CropLife and FAO? What is known about the influence of the industry and WHO institutions and governments? Any whistleblowers known? Question mark. So perhaps Saro.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question. I think the alliance between FAO and CropLife was recently announced that they wanted to have a working, working more closely and more concretely. And so it was something that was announced, and they were having all these meetings. During the FAO Council meeting, the information on the alliance was shared, and the DG of FAO now is from China and used to be the Vice Minister of Agriculture. And there was all this, agreements between Syngenta and China, and you must understand that China, ChemChina bought over Syngenta, so there is that, the links. And there was also all these agreements between the Chinese government and Bayer. And so he brings that, the close relationships that have been built to the FAO, and we are very critical that they were doing this, what we called it the toxic alliance, because CropLife, as Laurent was sharing, is selling many of the highly hazardous pesticides. They're not just the only association of pesticide producers, but they're quite a major player. And all aspects of their members have continued to sell paraquat, have been selling polo, many of the highly hazardous pesticides. And so therefore we said, we need to expose this, the toxic alliance between FAO and CropLife. And they have not stopped, and they are not even open to having discussions with us. about this. Although we had a letter of 350 CSOs and global networks and grassroots groups writing to the DG to ask him to stop this toxic alliance. Together with there were other letters from scientists as well. Another 250, I think, of scientists who signed a letter to the DG. That's it.
Thank you, Saro. Yes, that's making people aware of what's going on and trying to find allies to fight against, because we had questions, so what can be done against this crop life cooperation? And there was also the question just linked to this. The international criminal law are currently drafting plans for a legal crime of ecocide, criminalizing the destruction of the world's ecosystems. Will the use of highly hazardous pesticides be or could be included? Maybe this question, I don't know who of the panelists would like to answer this question.
I can talk a little bit about ecocides. So Polly, whose idea it was, the idea concept of ecocide, actually spoke at a pan-UK event nearly 10 years ago when she was promoting the concept, and she argued really clearly and compellingly that HHP use could easily be classed as ecocide, and the way that corporations are promoting the unsustainable use of pesticides, which damages the environment in such a catastrophic way, would easily contravene such a new law. And so, I mean, I think it's got an uphill battle, but I think ecocide is a really useful concept that would that will strengthen international law, and I think that pesticide use, particularly HHP use, would almost inevitably fall foul of such a new law. Thanks.
Thank you, Kees. I just saw in the chat that there's somebody shared that CropLife is busy also in South Africa, and there's a link for everyone to have a look at. I have to confer perhaps with Elnat or Ilang. Shall we have another question? Maybe one last question, and then we have to come to an end. I think we are running out of time. Okay, so or maybe I just or is there anything one of the panelists would like, after this discussion now, would like to add that seems to be missing from our discussion? That's also a possibility. Otherwise, I will just read out one of the questions. So there was a question regarding HHPs in Europe, and if there, I can't find it, but I remember that there was a question whether there is a list where we can find which European, if there's like a registration for European HHPs, and there I can just answer that quickly. There is not such, so we can find a list where we have pesticides on the European market that are HHPs according to the FAO WHO. We don't have this, so we are still hoping for an such a list to be issued that every region can look up, okay, what are HHPs according to this criteria, and in meanwhile, until this is offered by FAO WHO, we are filling this gap with our list. Yes, we also received a hint that pesticides giants make billions from bee harming and carcinogenic chemicals. Thank you for sharing this, Laurent, in the chat. That is the last, let me see, last question. So there was a question, are you aware of countries taking into account the non-compliance with the so-called safe use in their authorization process? Is there anybody who would like to answer this question? Apparently not. Maybe that's something very detailed. So there was another question. I don't know whether we have an answer to this. I'm after some recommended protocol to conduct demographically representative pesticide biomonitoring in our population in South Africa as part of an advocacy campaign. And there's a question if everybody can recommend some useful guidelines. So maybe there.
I have to say that I contacted the person who asked this question directly and proposed that we get into contact tomorrow or day after tomorrow about details.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Peter. I think so. I think it is nearly it's 1:45 over. So as we are already 50 minutes late, I think we have come to a good end of our meeting, and I thank you, all of the participants, all of the panelists. Special thank to PAN-AP to make this technically a perfect webinar. Thanks so much for your support. And then I remind you that this webinar has been recorded, so we may make it available, maybe not this year, maybe early next year, but you will receive a message. So thanks to all of you for your questions, for your comments, and for taking part. So I say goodbye in the name of PAN International. Have a good day, night, morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Susan.
Bye.
Bye-bye then.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.